Mr. Chairman. It's great to be here. I have a short presentation time. Kyle has already introduced some of the topics, so I will skip a few slides, and you can come and talk to me on booth X0 anytime during the conference to learn a bit more. So I've worked in the Inkjet Research Centre in Cambridge for 10 years, and one of the typical sorts of arrangement we use for looking at single nozzle printheads, we've got another method which we used 9 years ago when I took this winning photograph of inkjets from a Tsar printhead, just using a Nikon, but I was also using a spark flash system developed in Germany, which gave a 20 nanosecond exposure time. So the point is, the image is frozen. It doesn't have blur, which is very important when you want to measure where drops are in flight. So my interest at this point is on whether we should develop international standards for the measurement of drop speeds, volumes, and trajectories. And I work with the International Electrotechnical Committee, which is an international community of experts, working towards drafting standard methods for making measurements of drop speed, then drop volume, and drop direction. The first standard has been drafted on drop speed for about the last 18 months, and is actually due to be finalised over the next year, and then it will be put through all the official channels and become an international standard by the end of 2017. It will probably take 3 years from now to develop a drop volume standard for inkjet. So why? Well, for industrial users, particularly in PE, printed electronics, you actually want to know the speed of impact at the substrate, because that controls the splashing and the wetting of the material on the substrate. That will affect image quality. And you also want to know how much is coming down with each drop. In particular, you want to find out whether the drop-by-drop volume is reproducible or varies, and how much it varies. So we want to help develop standards which specify how you can get accurate and precise values for these things. Well, drop speed is actually still contentious, but is a lot easier than the drop volume. But typically you can measure the drop speed to a percent or better, whereas drop volume, you're doing very well if you better 6% in absolute terms, which sounds pretty awful, but is the reality. So we're obviously trying to develop methods that improve that, to improve the quality of applications of inkjet printing and the inkjet monitoring systems. And the questions are how you actually make benchmarks for these speeds and volumes, because there are quite a lot of variables in inkjet, and they're it's quite important to specify how you make the measurements and under what conditions you're using the inks, the printheads, the environment, and so on, and the imaging system, the lighting, the exposure time, and all these. There are a lot of conditions. Just to take a few examples, where to measure the drop speed is quite important. Do you measure it right at the nozzle? Do you measure it right at the substrate? Do you measure it where it's convenient? Well, if you don't specify that in a standard, or between manufacturer and manufacturer, how do you compare different printheads? How do you set up your application if the speed is important? And as a physicist, I know that speed is important. What are the systematic errors? What are the measurement method errors? The drop volume, actually the biggest one is the focus. If you haven't got focused image, the drop volume can be wildly wrong. And if you've got a system that can't resolve drops with a large number of pixels, you'll get a very crude answer, because the drop volume depends on the cube of the size. And so any size error gets magnified by a factor of 3. So volume is really tough by comparison with speed. Now, Kyle introduced several methods. I won't go through these in detail, but they essentially boil down to strobe flash, which is the easiest single strobe system. The N-flash, which could be double strobing, double pulsing, triple pulsing, burst pulsing, tends to give you images in several locations of the same drop, and you can get more information provided there aren't large numbers of drops in the field of view. Of course, in industrial printing, you have multiple rows, multiple nozzles, and you're printing fast. So it's kind of tough. But there are some other methods that are more research level that also exist. My colleague, Professor Hutchings, who's talking in track 2 now, and his colleagues have been using holography to measure drops. In particular, double flash holography in 3D gives you drop speed, drop volume, and drop direction with extraordinary precision. You can get diameter accuracies better than 100 nanometers and speeds at fractions of a percent, volumes but around the 1% level. So as a research tool, holography is fantastic. But anybody who's worked with holographic systems, with lasers and holograms and inkjet printers at the same time, knows it's quite an exacting task. So it's not a rugged industrial method. It's something that researchers can use and study things in drop formation. Likewise, the video imaging. If you've got enough money to afford 1 million frames or 15 million frames per second camera, you can learn a lot about drop formation. And that's the sort of thing we do in our research labs, but it isn't something you do in industry. So these are methods that are available, but are not realistic for an industrial standard. So it will boil down to strobing with 1 flash or strobing with 2 flashes. The location of the substrate is clearly an important point to measure drop speeds. But if you had a target location of, say, 1 millimeter, normally you'd expect the inkjet fluid to have necked back down, collapsed back down to drops, but not always. Depends on the fluid type. If you've got polymers in there, high molecular weight polymers tend to distend the ligaments, but also when you start getting at higher and higher frequencies, you find the drops start to merge together. So the measurement location is critical to measurement of speed and volume. With volume, it's a pretty poor image in this light, I'm afraid. But basically, if you get images like that and you try to measure drop volume, you're going to have a hard time of it, because you can see it's pixelated if you can see it from back there. But if you've got about 10 pixels across the image, your drop volume is not going to be even 10%. So you need very high resolution system. You need enough light intensity to make the measurements. So it's not straightforward. If you really want to make a good job and understand systems in development, say of printheads or development of an ink, you need high quality systems. As I say there, at the standard level, we were looking at potentially 5 different methods. We've probably knocked off several of them now because they're just not precise enough and reproducible enough for people to use. The first approach, which involved when you trigger the printhead to print something, you then measure it at the substrate, and that gives you the drop velocity. Well, that's a very easy way of doing it, but it doesn't take into account any delays in production of a drop caused by a printhead trigger. So it's very unreliable as a method. However, it is the simplest, so people still do it. But if you really want to compare printhead to printhead, you have to do a lot better. So you have to get more involved, and I'm not going to go through that here. So, as I say, there is a technical committee. At the moment, the drop speed measurement is headed by a professor from Korea, Kai-Si Kwon, who's worked in that area for a while. And yeah, Kipman is also one of the experts. He's from Image Expert. So he represents the USA on that. I represent the UK, the Japanese, Chinese. Unfortunately, there are no German or French or Dutch. So it would be really nice if somebody came up to me and said, after the meeting, while I'm at the tabletop or whenever, actually, I know a lot about this and I'm a user. I could tell you what's important for us. So I'm not giving this presentation as a one-way thing. I want you to come and tell me how it really is. That's part of the reason I've got this slot, which was offered by Image Expert, because they think too that standardization is important for all of us, whether we're academic or users. So thank you very much for listening. I'm on Tabletop X0. My name's Steve Hoath, and I'm also editor of a book which is due out in February. This is the scientific level book on what's going on in inkjet printing. So I'm not allowed to do promo, so I'll get rid of it. But again, you can come and talk to me anytime. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for Dr. Steve Hoath? Or do you join him later at the tabletop?
Talk to me like 0. It depends on your resolution system. I mean, the ones that I look at are probably no smaller than 3 to 5 picolitres. I wouldn't want to go much smaller at the moment, but I know the industry wants 1 picolitre. But measuring 1 picolitre is kind of tough. So validation of the measurements is also one of the reasons why researchers are involved, because people like me can go away and work with the national standards in the UN NIST or the UK's accreditation bodies to see if we can develop reference standards for calibrating people's imaging systems. And that needs to be taken into account in the standards. Thank you.